Hej, jag heter Erik Lysén och jag är internationell chef på Svenska kyrkan. Och jag ska moderera det här seminariet om Mellanöstern bortom rubrikerna, en av vår tids mest konfliktfyllda regioner. Vi kommer att titta på den situation som vi har i många av de här konfliktdrabbade länderna, och med oss i panelen har jag Afrah Nasser, en ung journalist från Jemen och känd bloggare, räknas som en av de 10 mest inflytelserika bloggarna från arabvärlden av CNN. Afrah studerar i Göteborg sedan några år tillbaka, men vi kommer att ha seminariet på engelska så vi kan ha ett fint flöde här mellan panelisterna. Vi har också Bitte Hammargren, mångårig korrespondent från Svenska Dagbladet, som kommer bidra med sina perspektiv, har länge skrivit från regionen och dess länder. Frilansar just nu, skrev en bok som heter Gulfen, en framtida krutdurk. Med oss i panelen har vi också Henningsson, ämnesråd på Utrikesdepartementet, islamexpert, tidigare direktor för Svenska institutet i Alexandria i Egypten. Han var direktor under 6 år. Första frågan går till Bitte Hammargren om utvecklingen den senaste tiden.
I'd like to start with quoting a foreign diplomat in Lebanon in the 80s who said, "If you think that you understand Lebanon, you are probably not well informed." And I would say that the same goes for the Middle East. If you really think that you understand the complexities of the Middle East, you are badly briefed because there's such a diversity. But I'll do my best trying to focus on 3 of the countries. Of course, history matters, but Henningsson will go deeper into these issues. All of the countries have their special features, and Afrah will, of course, elaborate on Yemen. But if we just look at the broader view, what happened before the uprising started? Well, since the borders were sort of drawn by the colonial powers after the First World War, we had basically authoritarian regimes in every Arab countries. During the Cold War, the monarchies more or less were supported by the US and the republics more or less by the Soviet Union. Some 12 years ago, the UNDP issued the first series of Arab Human Development Report. It's highly interesting. The first report sort of set the diagnosis of the problems in the Arab world, and they pinpointed 3 deficits. The Arab world was the region who had the largest deficits in terms of political rights. They had the largest deficits in terms of women empowerment and the largest deficits in terms of education. And so this is what's the bottom line. And of course, those who wrote this report, they were Arab intellectuals writing for an Arab audience, and they were calling the regimes to work to open for change and reform. The regimes didn't listen. So things started to evolve then in December 2010, starting with Tunisia and after that Egypt. I followed those uprisings in one country after the other. I also went to Saudi Arabia where everything was cracked down. But if I would take 3 examples of this region, may I start with Libya? Libya is the only country in the world where the UN has mandated the so-called program for responsibility to protect. This is why we had the NATO intervention. And Libya, with the NATO intervention and the bombings from the air, was actually the case where we first saw the deep rift between Putin's Russia and the West. Because Russia and many of the regimes, like the Assad regime, felt that NATO was grossly misusing the UN mandate by bombing out Gaddafi. And he was, as you remember, lynched on the streets. He was not taken to a court. During the campaign in Libya, there was also the looting of the garrisons and the armaments, which ended up Libya having a case with Well, some years ago when I was last there, they said they had 400 different militias. Today they have probably even more militias. They had a good first election, but they never managed to disarm the militias. And within those militias, you had former officers who had defected from the Gaddafi regime on the one side, and on the other side you had Islamists who had been persecuted by the very same officers. Could they work together under one military umbrella? Of course not. And also, added to that, you had the influence from various regional powers who tried to use various militias as their tool of interest. So they also clashed. Turkey clashed with Egypt, for instance, on Libyan soil, supporting different factions. Today in Libya, we have one place which has called itself an emirate under the Islamic Caliphate of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And this is Derna in eastern Libya. I happened to travel to Derna in the height of the revolution in April 2011. And this was a place who used to send jihadis to Iraq. But during the revolution, I was so warmly welcomed by those Salafists with the long beards. And, you know, they were hoping for a democratic change at some time. Today, I wouldn't dare to go near Derna because bad things would happen there. So this is an example how quickly things change on the ground.
And that's only 4 years ago when you were there.
Exactly. And of course, Libya has its tribal differences, which matters as well. Do I have time to elaborate on Egypt?
You have time to elaborate. You mentioned 3.
Yes, exactly. Egypt. Now, people took to the streets in January 2011. I was there as well. We all thought this is a revolution. But things happened behind the scenes. And I write about this in my book, actually, because the military, the deep state of Egypt, they used the popular uprising against Mubarak for a certain purpose. They used it as a way to get rid of the possibility that the son of Mubarak, Gamal Mubarak, would become the next president. Because the generals despised Gamal Mubarak. They didn't want to have him. So the military stood passively with their armored vehicles between the police apparatus and the demonstrators. They got rid of Mubarak, and they got rid of the chance that Gamal Mubarak would become the next president. Then the Egyptians, as you remember, they did go for elections. They did have democratic elections. And of course, the Muslim Brothers won the elections. Why? Because they are the best organized political power in Egypt. But it's important to remember that in the first round of the presidential elections, when there were various candidates, Morsi only got 25%. I mean, this is the core constituency of the Muslim Brothers. The Egyptians as a whole do not follow the Muslim Brothers. In the second round, when it was only Morsi and the candidate of the old regime, he won with a sharp marginal. Behind the scenes, again, the Gulf states started to work. They've done so from the very first moment when the people took to the streets. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they were frightened to death when they saw that President Obama didn't side with Mubarak. He changed, vacillated from different positions. So the Gulf states decided that they have to influence the situation in Egypt and by supporting the military. And also, during the rule of Morsi, he became increasingly unpopular with the Egyptian population. And there were, material things like the lack of fuel at the filling stations where people would have to wait for hours getting gas. So this also undermined the role of the Muslim Brothers. And the military was in control of the deliveries of gas to the filling stations. So the deep state could use this influence. And the political opposition then in Egypt, those representing the 75% who did not vote for Morsi in the first round of elections, what did they do? Well, they sided with the military in the coup in 2013, instead of organizing for fresh elections. And I think that this is a tremendous backlash for the region and for Egypt, because it's going to take a long time for democratic forces to build up again. And then you have the cases where the deep state is now trying to crush the Muslim Brothers by arbitrary death sentences. It works for a while, but you cannot uproot the Muslim Brothers. They are there. The problem is with ousting the Muslim Brothers by a military coup is that this is the third time in the Arab world where branches of the Muslim Brothers have tried to get to power by ballot boxes, by elections. Every time they have been deceived. It happened in Algeria in 1990 in the elections. It happened with Hamas, who were isolated when they won the Palestinian elections, and then it happened with Egypt. So the lesson learned for those supporting the Muslim Brothers, is it the case, do they believe in democratic change through the ballot boxes? We cannot be so sure about that. There is a risk that they will go for violent means instead. This is about Egypt. If we take then the case of Syria, Bashar al-Assad was saying in an interview in early 2011 that a change like in the rest of the Arab world, it wouldn't happen to Syria. Syria it's a different case. And many thought so until the fire was ignited in a city in the south of Syria, Daraa. And of course, as you may remember, the first demonstrations were peaceful. The regime cracked down on them. But there was a change in the summer of 2011 for several reasons. There were defectors from the Syrian army. There was a decision among Islamists meeting in Libya who decided to send weapons from Libya, from the looted army garrisons, and to send them to the Syrian opposition by airplane from Turkey. And there was the case when Assad released the security prisoners, the jihadists, several hundreds of them from a security prison, Sednaya. And this happened while he was cracking down on peaceful demonstrators and torturing them. But the jihadists were released from their prison. Why? Well, you can see that Bashar al-Assad wanted to have the perfect enemy. And he certainly got a perfect enemy, maybe you would say a bit too perfect. So how come then that the Salafists with the Islamic State became so powerful in Syria? Well, I would call it, it's sort of the Darwinism of the battlefield. A stronger group sort of eats up the weaker ones. And the Salafist groups were armed, financed by money from the Gulf states, and the border from Turkey became so vaporous. So, as you know, fighters and arms could go both ways in Turkey and Syria. On the other hand, you also had a case where 120 countries or so call themselves the Friends of Syria, sort of the friends of the opposition for a democratic change. But those friends of Syria, they didn't really have a clue of what to do. And the opposition sitting in Turkey was sort of representing themselves, whereas those having control on the ground of the fighters, they would not abide by whatever was said by the opposition leaders in Turkey. Then you had the friends of Assad, who always stood, who were very consistent. Russia and Iran, they have supported him all along the line, and Assad is stronger today than he was 2 years ago. And then, again, you had the friend of the Salafist, the Takfiri Salafist, money, millions pouring in from the Gulf states. It happened at a time when Saudi Arabia had head of the intelligence, Bandar bin Sultan, who was the one who helped to support the Afghani Arab fighters in Afghanistan, those who later became Al-Qaeda. This Bandar bin Sultan was later ousted from the House of Saud. He's now marginalized, but during his period as the head of the intelligence, we saw this surge of Islamist Salafi fighters in Syria. And this is the case where we have now the Islamic State also operating under their radar. They are different from Al-Qaeda. They are much more efficient. They have a vision of nation building, caliphate building, and they have military skills which they got from army officers from the old Saddam regime in Iraq, those who were dismantled from power when the US invaded Iraq in 2003. So everything clings together here. And those secular Saddam officers met with the Salafists in American prisons in 2003. This is where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi met some of the old army officers, and they built up this alignment. So this is where we stand today, and the region is in deep trouble. And I think I will finish there and leave the floor to
Absolutely, Bitte. Now we understand some of the complexities because of this quick round around these three countries, but nevertheless incredibly interesting. But just to follow up on some of the things you said, in order for us to better understand, which is the purpose with this seminar, you said that the Gulf states, the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, started to influence the events in Egypt after it was clear that the Muslim Brotherhood was popular. And they sort of thrown in the lot with the military. Can you explain why?
Oh, that's the
why that is the case, that they wanted to support the military against the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yes. Why so? Because the best organized political opposition within Saudi Arabia and within the United Arab Emirates are the branches of the Muslim Brothers. Saudi Arabia used to support the Muslim Brothers in the 50s and the 60s when Nasser cracked down on them in Egypt. In those days, there was a Cold War between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. But as we saw the Arab uprisings some years ago, the regime, the House of Saud, was very scared that their people would take to the streets in Saudi Arabia as well. And they knew that the Muslim Brothers in their own country are the intellectuals, lawyers, doctors, academics. These are the people who abide to the Muslim Brothers. The same thing with the United Arab Emirates. So in both these countries, the Muslim Brothers have been labeled terrorist organizations. It's as a means to silence them completely.
And perhaps another question, and probably Jan can come in there as well. I mean, understanding the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood, their ideology, their theology, and the Salafist ideology. Because here you make a clear distinction. So for us to understand, we know that the Saudi Arabia has also been spreading the Salafist theology around the world, and therefore is sort of fermenting some of these movements. So that's a question we can discuss further on, but still just a
I know that my co-panelists will add some things here, but as a general idea, the Muslim Brothers have a possibility to be more pragmatic. I mean, I've met with Hamas leaders, I've met with the Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt. You can sit with them and discuss and debate. You can debate with Hamas, why do you send rockets targeting Israeli schoolyards and so. I mean, you can have a discussion and you can enter this. And they've shown an interest to be part of the international institutions as well. The Takfiri Salafists have a completely different outlook. the Muslim Brothers do acknowledge that there are Christians minorities, whereas Takfiri Salafists will have the concept that there can be only one religion which is accepted, which is the case in Saudi Arabia. You don't have any churches there. You don't have any synagogues. It's completely forbidden. And they also consider Shiite Muslims to be kafir, to be infidels, not real Muslims, so they are legitimate targets for killings, which you've seen now in the attacks against the Shiite mosque in Kuwait recently and in Saudi Arabia. So basically speaking, the Muslim Brothers also have the idea of a caliphate, but they are more pragmatic.
Okay. What you also said was that, and that's perhaps somewhat surprising, that given the fact that Morsi won the elections, especially in the second round, then it was only 25% support in the first round, but then he was elected as president, but only a year later, as you said, ordinary Egyptians sided with the military coup. So quick and so fast. I mean, how can we understand that? Because you had a window of opportunity there, and that was something we discussed at another seminar yesterday.
I mean, the case is so volatile all the time. Like I said, with the case with Derna in Libya, those long-bearded people who, really wanted to embrace me, even though they couldn't touch me because I'm a woman. But such a warm and welcoming atmosphere some years ago. Today, people like me and Afrah would be killed coming there. And this is how volatile the situation is. And it's also the case with this, let's say, liberal or social democratic opposition parties. They are so poorly organized. I mean, they haven't done a homework which is necessary to do. They belong to the elite structures. They don't have an outreach to the popular circles in Egypt. So, and like the COP, they felt, well, there's no security for us now. We'd better go with the military instead.
I will let Jan and Afrah as well to comment on sort of this broad overview that Bitte has presented, and especially on what we have seen both in Egypt and Syria. If there's any reflections that you have, perhaps you want to intervene on this difference between the Salafist movement and the Muslim Brotherhoods as well. Jan, please join us for the panel here.
Yes.
I gave Jan the possibility to sit down.
Yeah, an old man needs to rest.
Old man needs to rest.
Maybe I can comment a little bit on this later, but when it comes to the Salafis, of course, not all of them are Takfiris.
No.
You have at least 3 strands of Salafis, and they confessed their colors only gradually during the Arab Spring. You have the theologians, the literals, who were very skeptic towards any kind of political involvement, who have stayed aloof from parliamentarism and still do so in other parts of North Africa. And you have the Takfiris, those whom Bitte describes so eloquently, who actually anathemize all others, including Muslims, Shia, and non-Salafi Sunnis. And then you had those Salafis who were actually tempted to enter the political scene and who persuaded the elders, those with the strongest religious authority, legitimacy, the literalists, to join. So I think an explanation for the overwhelming victory by the Islamists in the Egyptian elections after the fall of Mubarak was the fact that the Salafis joined. Interestingly, the Sufis, those who like to sit in rooms like this and meditate and pray, they tried in vain several times to form a political coalition. 18 movements met in Cairo, but they decided that they were not meant to be politicians, so they opted out.
Afrah, anything to add?
I mean, Bitte have given us a great overview about the region, but I would like to stress on the fact that if you try to understand the Middle East, you have to not look at it in a holistic way. It's 22 countries with 22 different histories and political features and developments also, different developments. But I would say like there is a common thread between most of the Arab countries that we saw in the post-Arab Spring, like the developments that happened, that there is a birth and death of orders at the same time. And Bitte has touched upon some of the things I want to talk about, but in brief I would say there is like the main three orders that are dismantling and the birth of a new order at the same time. And the three orders are like the post World War, First World War political situation and
the nation states that were created.
In the region, and then also the post-World War, the second post-World War, and then the Cold War also, and then also following the 1970 Arab states situation, where most of them become ruled mainly by one family rule in most of the Arab countries, and that's what we are seeing. What we saw with the Arab Spring, most of the Arab or the revolting countries, they were revolting against one family rule, whether in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen, and definitely most of the monarchies in the Gulf states. Most of them, they were like preparing the following ruler that is a relative, whether a son or a nephew or. So that with the Arab Spring, we saw like the death of all those orders, and then at the same time, now we're seeing a new order in the shape or in the make that it's still very unclear, like what kind of order the new order will be. Definitely for each country there will be a new order, but I think the fundamental problem in most of this whole region, if I try to summarize it in a very, for me it's a very fair generalization, because most of those countries have been ruled by a military rule for a long time, and that's maybe one of like the unique region in the whole world that as a bloc, like as a whole region that have been ruled by a military rule for a lot of time, that they were not able, following all those world war, they were not enabling kind of a democratic process that we have seen in Latin America, for example, or in different countries in the world. But like in principle, I think something I always try to remember, that revolutions, I think we are still in the first 5 minutes of revolution.
Absolutely.
And the cycle of revolutions throughout history, like there are 3 different stages. The first are like the hope and the excitement that most of the time are like intense with the people who are not involved even with the revolution, like how I've experienced in Sweden, for example. In 2011, there was a hype of interest and more than where the countries were revolting. And then the second phase usually is with the mass energy, the engagement, where everyone trying to figure out what to do. There might be leaders, there might not. The youth participate, the women participate, and that's like where the action happens. And definitely the crackdown and the violent aspect of those revolution. And there will be the final stage, that's the reaction, where things are like settled and there will be the new shape of a new order or something similar to that. But yeah, I think and bottom line, we're still in the 5 minutes of...
We're still in the 5 minutes, yeah, but it's something else will rise out of the ashes. Is that what you're saying? You wanted to comment?
Yes. You asked the question also of Bitte primarily about the 2 Egyptian uprisings. The first against the Mubarak regime and the military dictatorship, and the second one against the Morsi regime. And I think if you want to summarize these two uprisings, you can say that the first one was for dignity, for the dignity of the citizen, going from being a subject to being a participator in your society, to actually becoming a citizen. The word karama, dignity, was used already before the revolution. It's not found in the Quran, but it is let's say, an all-embracing concept. The second uprising, I believe, Bitte, was what we may call an uprising for personal freedom. The freedom to choose your lifestyle, because those of us who have lived in Egypt during the years of increasing confessionalization, Islamization of the public space, and increasing pressure on people to put on the hijab or niqab and to pray and to fast even if you're sick and so on, we know that the pressure became almost unbearable. And when people discovered that the new government under Morsi, who was also under various kinds of pressures behind the curtains, they felt that the dignity that they had finally acquired was threatened, and now there was time to fight for your personal freedom. So I think there was a psychology in that as well.
I think if I can comment about this, like two revolutions happening, and even with the other Arab countries, I think what's very confusing about the Middle East is that you have all those events happening in a very short period. Two revolutions in one country over like 2-3 years, and then civil wars, sectarian wars, terrorist attack happening, and also like a rise of youth movements and happening in a very short time, that if you look to other parts of the world, that has taken over maybe, I don't know, 2 decades or 3 decades, where there will be like revolution and then some kind of stability, and then maybe civil war and some kind of stability.
Exactly.
But that's what makes it very confusing with the Middle East, and overwhelming at the same time.
Bitte.
And I think it's interesting to compare with what happened in East Europe after the Cold War. Those countries had a roadmap. They had the European Union. It's not a perfect union, as we know, but there still was a like institutional roadmap for these countries. For the Arab world, there was nothing. There was no roadmap at all. And it's worth comparing with the French Revolution. How many years didn't it take for... I mean, we had La Terreur just after the French Revolution, and maybe the Arab world is in this phase now, La Terreur.
Coming back to the example of Libya that you mentioned in your introduction, where the Western powers established the no-fly zones and still were unable to continue the support to the new dispensation in terms of disarming the militia. So what's your reflection on that? So it was just to stop Gaddafi but not to build the institutions, or what? I mean, in terms of the discussions we had within the European Union or by the Americans? Or?
I think this has to be thoroughly analyzed, and it hasn't been done enough. But because all the Western powers who took part in this, they had their own agendas. France, under Sarkozy, well, he probably had an interest in, ousting Gaddafi, because he was... First, Sarkozy had made a mistake in Tunisia before by not supporting the demonstrators, by siding with Ben Ali. Historic mistake. He wanted to repair it in Libya by supporting an uprising from the air, but he probably also had an interest in Gaddafi not surviving and going to court, because there are enough rumors in France that Gaddafi financed part of the presidential campaign of Sarkozy. If we take Sweden now, joining with surveillance aircraft in Libya, well, I think that Sweden had an interest in showing NATO countries that JAS Gripen was compatible and interoperable with the NATO system, because this is the message I heard from the military at Folk och Försvar conference. I mean, all countries have their own agendas, and they didn't have a follow-up agenda on Libya, what would happen. and it was, I mean, grossly mismanaged, because we wouldn't have the problems in Mali, in Sahel, in those other countries with violent groups there, if the garrisons had not been looted and under no control.
But it's true, as you said, this step-by-step approach, not knowing exactly where to go and what kind of support to give, which has also been a feature of sort of EU politics towards the region. Just reflecting on what you said, Afrah, in terms of the old order and the new order will hopefully be born, and then still the very gloomy picture that we see today, that Assad is still in power in Syria. And I heard yesterday at another seminar in the Middle East where the Swedish journalist Per Jönsson said that probably he will stay on for quite some time because he's the strongest figure now, and he will be able to resist the advance of the Islamic State, and he will have the resources to do so. Would you? So therefore he would probably over time also be a new ally of the West in order to stop the Islamic State. What do you think about that kind of observation, that analysis?
I think that's kind of a simplistic way to analyze the situation in Syria. It's it's multidimensional. There is so many actors engaged in the conflict in Syria, especially with the rise of the ISIS. I don't want to call them the Islamic State because I don't want to give them the legitimacy, even though they are they're emerging as a very powerful and expanding and sustainable terrorist organization. But I think it's very unpredictable with Syria, definitely. But what is very important for the international community to know that there are new emerging actors in Syria that are not necessarily religiously motivated or following like Jabhat al-Nusra or the other religious groups. That needs those groups. They need a safety net, and that needs also a creative or a new kind of thinking from the international community to maybe to help those new networks. And I mean, it seems in Syria the situation might be as it is, not moving forward or going backward for some time. And what worries me the most is the human cost for this kind of stagnation. Because it's very tragic with the refugees pouring around the neighbors countries. Only 7% of Syrian refugees are in Europe. But it's really about like how the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria is splitting all over the region. I think we always have to mention that whenever we talk about Syria as well. Or the political situation.
It's like half of the population that has fled, where something like 7-8 million are internally displaced, and more than 3 million have crossed over to the neighboring countries, and a very small trickle to Europe.
I mean, even overall, this year have been witnessed like a record of refugees and asylum seekers all over the world. I think some percent of them are Syrian, but there are 60 million refugees or displaced people or asylum seekers. That is a record, and that also, like the crisis of numbers of refugees is also a crisis of politics. I think there is a crisis of an international political structure that is not understanding this increasing amount of violence and conflicts in different parts of the world.
What has happened perhaps over the past 6 months or even a year is that somehow the war in Syria has been overshadowed by the events in Iraq and by the Islamic State advancing both in Syria and Iraq. Do you agree that this is also sort of very problematic for the people in Syria that are fleeing the war? Because the war continues, the bombings of the Assad regime continue every day, but in terms of the media headlines, they are not there, and the limelight is not on Syria at the moment. And And how will that affect the situation?
We usually joke with my Arab friends that you remember the old days when there was only the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, but now it's like too many conflicts happening, and it's very overwhelming to comprehend. But I think when it comes to Iraq, there is a fundamental factor that is causing the trouble and the turbulence with the Islamic State at their borders, and I mean they have taken control of Mosul several times. There are conflicting news about that, but I think the fundamental problem is inequality between the different already existing sectarian situations, and following the invasion of Iraq, the international community, represented by the U.S. foreign policy and the European foreign policy in Iraq, also really overlooked the root of the already existing sectarian conflicts, and have been funding military efforts without accountability, without looking into the kind of governance in the country. And that has been have done harm more than good, definitely. So there has to be a new way of dealing with the different or the type of governance in Iraq at the moment.
But you wanted to say something. I think you can be heard.
Just a word about the position of Bashar al-Assad. Like his father, he likes to present himself as the defender of religious freedom, and especially the bulwark for Christians against various types of Islamists persecuting them or anathemizing them. And in this, Bashar al-Assad has been greatly helped by the Russians, the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill and his foreign minister Hilarion, they have come to Damascus. They have forced, at that time, the Patriarch Hazim to stand beside them under the portrait of Bashar al-Assad and his father, and to be there as the only guarantors for Christians to remain in the region. And of course, for the Church of Sweden and for the Swedish government, in this country where we have the largest population of Syrian Orthodox outside the Middle East, this is really a challenge to show critical solidarity. To be in solidarity, but also not to be uncritical towards the stance that the Church has taken. And I think the Vatican has shown the way when they already in the summer of 2011 criticized the Catholic connected church leaders in Syria for being too lenient and too silent against their government.
And I think this is the case for many Christian communities throughout the region. And of course, as you mentioned, we have very authoritarian states, and you need to negotiate with them in order to have some kind of right to exist and live and to be a religious community. But that takes me to that question, because now in Syria and Iraq, and that is something that catches the headlines also here in Sweden about all these religious minority groups or different ethnic groups that are persecuted by either sort of the Assad regime or the Islamic State, and that now are fleeing. And this is widely reported on. When we talk to our partner churches and other partners in the region, they are a bit hesitant, a bit wary of using this term persecuted Christians when so many other groups are suffering and are being persecuted. So they rather emphasize the need for inclusive nation building, for secular constitutions and continued Christian presence. So in your opinion, I mean, given this enormously difficult situation for all these people, what is needed to keep the religious mosaic in the region and protect religious and ethnic minorities? Because this is part of the political debate here in Sweden today. Bitte, perhaps you want to start.
Since I have sometimes the Gulf perspective, I think it's very important to have the pressure on Saudi Arabia to open up for reform of Islam, because this Saudi interpretation of Sunni Islam has affected, I mean, mosques all over in Africa and in the Middle East, Indonesia, and Europe and the US today. So I think this is actually one core issue. I'll give the floor to you.
I would add on this also. I second what you said, and reportedly there are more than 2 million people living now under the territory of the ISIS. And guess what? The education material they are using, it's the same material that is used in Saudi Arabia. So I think that's the core of having like a seed of tolerance and the idea of coexistence. If we fix Saudi Arabia, we might fix other places. But that's like, I would say that's mission impossible.
It doesn't sound like an easy option to fix Saudi Arabia.
No, and I think to add on that, actually, what is happening now in Saudi Arabia under the new King Salman, who is even more authoritarian than his predecessor, King Abdullah, who did open for some reform. I mean, he took women into the consultative council, the Shura Council. Now, under King Salman, the number of executions, beheading has increased. If you take the case of the blogger Raif Badawi, I mean, the sentence is there, it's going to be upheld. And I think that this is the way for this House of Saud under King Salman to counter the influence from ISIS or the Islamic State within their own territory, because they are operating there. They have active cells, and they have a message to those who believe in Salafism that the House of Saud is corrupt, and they're not the true followers of Sunni Islam. So the House of Saud is using harsher methods to counterbalance this challenge.
But do you think the House of Saud will eventually be threatened also by the very same forces like the Islamic State, that this will undermine their...
They are, in a sense, now they're targeting Shiite mosques in Saudi Arabia, because you have Shiites in Saudi Arabia, which is a persecuted minority. They're living in bad conditions. And the Saudi military apparatus is not protecting them the way they should. And I think that, speaking about Saudi Arabia, what can be the tipping point here is for the king and his son, who is the deputy crown prince, is what's going to happen with the war in Yemen. And the deputy crown prince is also the minister of defense. He's only about 30 years old, and he's, playing around with all those military armament that they bought from the US in Yemen, and there is no... we don't see an end of this war, and it's going to sort of go down deep inside the House of Saud, where they have various branches of princes who try to compete with each other.
You mentioned Yemen. We'll soon come back to Yemen, and we'll focus specifically on that country. But you wanted to
before we forget the churches, we are in a cathedral. We were recently visited by the new patriarch for the Syrian Orthodox Church, who celebrated his first year after coronation in Sweden, Ignatius Mar Afrem. And he came with his delegation visiting the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. And he had a double message, let's say. The first message is well known, also in the United Nations, namely that the international community should try and establish some safe zone for the Christians. A corridor in Iraq, or a region south of the independent Kurdistan, for example. And there are many reasons why that would not be so fortunate. So we have, for example, the experience from the Balkans, where concentrating people from a certain confession, a certain group, makes it very easy to conduct ethnic cleansing if one is
the Bosnia scenario.
Yeah, the Bosnia, for example. So having discussed that and the issues of genocide that was raised several times because of the actions of Daesh, of the Islamic State, the second message was the following: Since we can, for the foreseeable future, not envisage a safe existence in the Arab world, in Syria or in Iraq, you must guarantee at least a safe haven in Södertälje. So actually the bottom line was help us so that hundreds or even thousands of immigrants from our region, from our church, in this case the Syrian Orthodox Church, don't have to sit and wait and be uncertain about their near future, but help them with asylum. I think this is a very sad scenario, but I think also this is the only realistic message.
And even today, I think we have many of the church leaders in Södertälje already.
Oh yes. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, just within brackets, is a discussion that's going on among Muslim scholars, and there's no time to refer it here, but perhaps the strongest theological response to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, to the Caliphate, and their misinterpretation of Islam is an open letter written by 111 Muslim scholars who gathered in Amman, Jordan in September last year. And in 24 points, they refute ISIS from top to bottom. And one of the items in this list of 24 is saying, remember that the Quran actually refers to the Yazidis as people of the book. Oh. This is an innovation, because in the Quran the word Yazid is not mentioned, it's the Majus. Mm-hmm. But these scholars have decided that the Majus mentioned in this historical context of the Quran must be a reference to the people that we call today the Yazidis, which actually gives them, in the eyes of Islamic, or the interpretation of Islamic law, special privileges, and that the slaughter or the deportation of Yazidis is especially repugnant to believing Muslims. One of many interesting items in this letter.
How influential do you think these intellectual scholars can become? I mean, how influential are they today in reaching out?
They send an open letter addressed to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi saying this is brotherly advice. No women have signed this document yet. Of course, nobody believes that he actually read it. At least he doesn't show that he has taken any impression from it. But the letter, as such, 40 pages in learned Arabic, translated into English, and now I think into other languages, is intended to be a guide for preachers and teachers around the world. Those who meet young people who may be on their way to become recruited, so that there is a kind of teaching aid how to present Islam in a different way than these kind of gut reaction attraction by ISIS videos.
If I may add, I think the problem with ISIS is really that they're completely unpredictable. I mean, just 2 days ago, they were responsible for an attack in Kuwait in a Shia mosque, and this is during the month of the holy Ramadan, which is, in Islam, it should be like completely forbidden to kill your brother or to wage any kind of violence in this month. There are 4 months as well. But that I mean, for a lot of people, the event by itself, it was like horrible and very tragic, but also adding the element of Ramadan was very shocking to many, and in a mosque. But that's what makes them very unpredictable. Basically, they're absolutely, they're not al-Qaeda, which have more clear ideological framework. But for them, I think because they are still starting, or maybe because there is something that is missing that we is not revealed yet. But they go with a concept that if you're not with us, you are a target. Yeah. Anyone who's outside the organization can be a target, even if you are Muslim. So the letter, is it efficient? Would it help? I mean,
we'll see.
I think we should move on to the conflict in Yemen. We have Afrah with us. And perhaps to ask many of us Swedes, we are ignorant about what's happening in Yemen. It's always overshadowed by other events in the region. But why is Saudi Arabia bombing the country? What's at stake? What has it meant for civilians, for women and girls? You are blogging a lot about the situation, but share with us your impressions.
before I answer that, I would like just to like set some fundamental aspects of
Absolutely.
Yemen. Yemen is the poorest Arab country for maybe 1 decade, the past 1 decade. 25 million of its population, half of them are living under the poverty line. There is a high percentage of illiteracy. The infrastructure in the country has always been very bad. And it was very surreal and unexpected for Yemen to start the revolution in 2011, along with the other Arab Spring countries, because of an element that is the tribal line structure and the social construction in Yemen, and plus also there were a lot of years of violence in this revolution, because Yemen is the second country that has a high rate of weapon per household after the United States of America. So there were a lot of speculation that we will see a civil war. And even Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president that ruled us for more than 3 decades, that the revolution were started against him, have always warned of there will be a civil war after me, there will be civil war. Like, he's always had this, he sold the idea to the world that this is not a country for a revolution, which is to some extent, I see that the revolution happened in a very complex situation, and that what makes Yemen very scary for analysis, because it's a very complex with the tribal line, the political line, its history. Yemen was divided before 1990,
Yes.
before the unification between the south and the
North
north.
and south, yeah.
So you had 2 Yemens and 2 different histories, and so that makes it a very complex country to analyze. But like fast forward, in March, last March, there were a war waged. I call it a war because the amount of violence cannot be described other than that. There was an intervention by the Saudi Arabia, and there were also a civil war on the ground. So you have double conflicts happening at the same time. Following the revolution in 2011, the GCC, the Gulf Council, had an initiative for Yemen to stop the crackdown from Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president. They had an initiative for him to transfer power with his conditions met. That's to give him impunity and to let him stay in the country. And there were a lot of mistakes in that kind of transition, because you cannot topple a dictator and let him stay in the country without any transitional justice or any accountability. And the international community, also represented by the United Nations, has also coordinated this power transfer deal. So you have the Gulf monarchies, and you have the United Nations operating this transition for Yemenis, while ignoring all the demands from the people for accountability, for elections, for I mean, they were completely detached from the reality. So that has been exacerbated for some time, till we reached a tipping point where like a long-standing rebel groups called Al-Houthi, Al-Houthi group, who has always been rebelling against the statehood. And I mean, I do this because Yemen has always been
internal strife, yeah,
like on the verge of a brink, and as a failed state. I mean, as a state, there always been a lot of weaknesses in the country. But for the rebels to take that vacuum of power following the revolution, and when Ali Abdullah Saleh was transferred, and then his vice president came to power as a transitional president in a one-man election without taking people's vote. I mean, like a concrete or transparent voting process. I mean, if he was basically assigned by Saudi Arabia to lead the country from the revolution into a more stable situation. That vacuum has created a perfect chance for the rebels groups to take power, and they stormed the presidential palace last year in September. And
do they have popular support somehow, or only among some tribal groups? The Houthis, Shia.
That's the thing. It's very convenient for media to call it as Shia and Sunni kind of fight, but the problem is with the Shia that they come from a social class that is called from a Sada, which are the descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay. They believe that their blood is a holy blood, and they maintain their class by marrying only from each other. And they come from the Zaydi sect, which come from the Shia school as well. But Yemen has always been this tribal lines and this class lines has always influenced the dynamics between the people. It's not as simple as it's Shia and Sunni. Yeah. So it's more complex than that, or it's a longer story. I would say for media, they want to just summarize the story with making it just a Sunni versus Shia. But now they have the popularity or the support from their class, and also for others who are trying to find any kind of protection. And the propaganda machine from the rebels group has always been very good at portraying themselves as a new political order that might bring Yemen to be a successful state, or to bring social justice for people. But Saudi Arabia was not happy about that. Yeah. And my only objection, or my main objection to the rebels groups taking power, is that you cannot take power and just demolish the idea of a republic state. Even if Yemen has been a failed state, but at least the Yemen today we know is the product of the revolution in 1962, and that's what started the idea of Yemen as a republic state. A state by the people, to the people, from the people. But as Houthis coming to take power, or anyone to come and do and make a coup against the president, or against any kind of political structure, without listening to the demands of the people, that I don't see is going to work. But for Saudi, it's more of going into... they don't want to see a democracy or democratic country in their backyard. That's the main big threat for Saudi Arabia. And their intervention, which is, I think it's a very interesting phenomena in the whole region. Also, Saudi has been leading kind of an intervention into an Arab country that we did not see before. We've always seen foreign intervention.
It's a new aggressive move on the part of Saudi Arabia that we haven't seen before.
Not only with Yemen. They started that with Bahrain following 2011. Bitte just talked about that. When they went, I mean, Bahrain is more than 500,000 population. They went in, they rolled down their tanks, and they cracked down on the people. And
I was there when it happened.
Yeah. So that was very shocking to many. And this is the same pattern that we're seeing for Saudi Arabia doing in Yemen. But from my perspective, they think if they could do it in Bahrain, they can do it in Yemen. But we are like a 25 million. There is a huge antagonism between Yemen and Saudi Arabia.
Saudi, yes.
So it's going to be a very, like a bloodbath between the two. And there is already more than 2,000 people, almost 3,000 people have been killed now in Yemen. More than 8,000 people have been wounded. Almost everyone of the 25 million population have been affected by the war in some way or another. The humanitarian situation is very catastrophic. I cannot even describe how it's basically as a slow death. People, if they're not killed by the bombs or the airstrikes by Saudi Arabia, or even by the rebels group, Al-Houthi, who are trying to take control of the south of Yemen. And that's the civil war element that I was talking about. So people, if they're not killed by the violence from the bullets and the tanks, they're killed by no food, no medicine, epidemic of infections and diseases are spreading. It's a very, very bleak and dire situation that I take this chance really for Sweden to really recognize the situation there, whether with diplomatic help, whether with humanitarian help, whatever assistance is available. I urge Sweden to remind us of what humanity is all about.
Some additional comments from Jan.
Now, just a question. One striking feature about the Arab uprisings during these past 4 years has been the virtual absence of charismatic leaders, figureheads that, like the free officers in Egypt, would lead the revolution, or Gaddafi. With one exception, and that is Tawakkul Karman from Yemen, who was awarded the Peace Prize in 2010. What was the impact of her this award? Did it help in any way? How was it received, or did it just pass by like a dragonfly?
No doubt, no question that Tawakkul's recognition was a recognition not only for Yemen, for the whole region with the Nobel Peace Prize. Tawakkul has always been a fantastic campaigner for freedom of expression and freedom of press, and she always maintained working in a political framework, not women's rights or a feminist framework. Today, because of the politics have been in a realignment period for some time, her political stance have always been like going according to how the situation was changing. There has been a huge crackdown on the Islah political party that she comes from, and she's always been advocating for their rights. And today the rebels groups in Yemen, Al-Houthi, their biggest enemy is the Islah political party, which they have Muslim Brotherhood influences. Yeah. So she's still there, and I believe she lives in Turkey at the moment because of the horrific amount of violence, and her house have been raided for some time by the rebels as well. But she's still advocating on international platforms and speaking of the atrocities in Yemen. But I would speak about the women's...
I will come back to that. It's actually only some 15 minutes left of this seminar. We thought we had plenty of time, 1.5 hours, but I feel we should have needed at least 3 hours because it's so interesting and we have so many aspects actually to talk about. But perhaps if you in the audience, if there's any question that you would like to ask the panelists, we can make space for that now. Otherwise, we will continue because we have lots of interesting issues to focus on, but feel free. I see no hands up in the air there. Per Larsson.
Yeah, for the video.
Sometimes in the international media about this region, the question of climate change And the drought, especially in Syria, has been mentioned as a contributing factor. Could you comment in short about that?
I mean, it's true. I mean, that the uprisings took place after years of severe drought. And I think that the issue of water is really crucial for the region. Also today, I visited Turkey during the elections now, and I visited the southeast where Turkey is building huge dams on the Euphrates and the Tigris. And, you know, this is where they start, and the rivers then go via Syria and Iraq. And I think that building those dams is also a political weapon for Turkey. And I think we increasingly have to see that the fight over water resource may trigger conflicts. I mean, this was the problem between Ethiopia and Egypt, for instance, on the Nile water, and it's definitely so.
I would add that Yemen also is expected to be one of the first Arab countries to run out of water. But I would explain the water shortage situation. It's because of a lack of good administration. Really, it's not something natural. It's just a lack of good administration to the resources and paying attention even and making it as a priority. Because in most of Arab countries, it's a matter of life or death at the moment. And then when you talk about environmental issues, it's like, what? But if there is no a good environment, I mean, people would live, where are they going to stay? Or, I mean, you need to take care of nature as well. So that's what I always link the bad environmental situation. It's really about lack of good administration.
Absolutely. And it's geopolitics, really, because if you look the way that ISIS built up the core territory, they started by taking control of water resources and oil resources, and then they expanded.
Exactly. Afrah, you wrote on your blog the other day, keep on excluding women, half of the society, and you'll end up with half peace and idiot patriarchal male politicians.
Yeah.
That's a good quote from your blog.
That was just a one sentence.
Yes.
I was in a hurry and I wrote that one sentence because I was mad because there were like the first significant peace talks for the situation in Yemen in Geneva 2 weeks.
No women participated.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. And I got a lot of criticism because a lot of people wrote to me like, why you're focusing on this now? It's not the right time to talk about this now. And I was like, but women are there all the time. Like, it's not they're there part-time.
Sort of part of society.
Yeah, they're the half of the society. And I really believe in women's participation for a longer lasting peace because they, I mean, even discussing it, it seems silly for me. How can you, I mean, why there is this idea of a demeaning perspective towards women to be sitting in a negotiating table? If all the people sitting at the table were women and there were not men, would you accept this? This is what usually I respond with. And it's like, no, there is this psychological mindset that women are not trustworthy to be sitting on those tables. And the thing is, what makes me really like go with confidence just to write one sentence and blog about that, it's women has been part of the revolution in Yemen in 2011, and even in this in the political process that happened afterwards, women have fought for 30% quota and to be seated among more than 500 members. So we have women. Yeah, we can discuss are they competent or not, but when you have a very discriminative situation, quota I believe is a very vital thing to impose, because women need a political will that push them in the scene. And the bottom line for me, it's like a longer vision that I attribute to my consciousness, to feminism, is women that's their rightful place to be at.
Do we see the emergence of strong women movements and civil society organizations right now? I mean, sort of, in what ways can we support the participation of women, women's rights? And that's probably through these local expressions of women's organizing themselves. But how does it look like, perhaps not only in Yemen, but in the region at large? Bitte as well.
I think I sort of feel like introducing Iran and Turkey into this discussion, because if you go to Iran, you will immediately be encountered by women, really calling for more to say in the society. They are discriminated, but they have the ability to go for change. And really, Iran is ripe for change. I think this is important to highlight. Also now when we have the vital discussions between the US and Iran. And the other factor is Turkey in these elections, because with the entrance of the HDP, pro-Kurdish party, suddenly you have a party in the parliament which was also elected by Turks. Why? Because it has a modern feature. They have a co-sharing, men and women, always, and when they have mayors, one man, one woman, they have the highest percentage of women among their candidates in the parliament. They are open for gays and lesbians as well. So they are sort of, establishing a sort of new modernism into the Middle East. And their hope is that this might inspire other groups in the region.
I think women's rights movements in the whole region has a long history. They were not they did not just happen following the Arab Spring or just now. No. They have a long history. Surely. And what I would like for maybe the international audience, or hearing this, or someone who's interested about women's rights in the Middle East, even though the whole concept of human rights is in a very tragic situation in most of the Arab countries. But what I would like from the other, to just have a sense of solidarity to the women's rights movement, and this kind of solidarity beyond borders is really what can make women anywhere empowered.
And to make a difference as well. I think we have a question from Nadine Wahab from the human rights activist and advocate from the Cairo's Institute of Human Rights Studies. I saw your hand up in the air, so perhaps you just want to add your perspective to this particular question.
Actually, it's a question. It's a comment, and built on that, a question. One of the issues of women engagement is how the international community discusses politics. You look for heads of families, or heads of tribes, or heads of parties, and they're mostly, even in Egypt, men. And it's it's viewed within the context of, we need someone to sit across the table with. One of the problems are when you actually go to the ground. This is what we saw on the square, the people passing out the blankets, the people bringing the hats, the hard hats, where the organizers were actually women. And I think one of the statements that keeps coming to my head, and we need to rethink how we negotiate these conflicts, is Margaret Thatcher, and I'm not a supporter of hers, but her statement as, when you want someone to talk, you look for a man. When you want someone to act, you look for a woman. This I didn't believe when I had lived abroad, but when I work on the ground, this is exactly how I feel. I am literally too busy on the ground trying to do what I need to do to go into a meeting that lasts 6 hours to talk with nothing at the end. So part of it is not only ensuring that women are included or you outreach to women, but ensuring that the process itself is something that is useful for women to engage in, because there are very, very important issues to deal with. And built on that, my question is, when you engage on the Middle East, or when you engage with this, how do you see the interaction with men, specifically in areas of conflict, versus your interaction with women. I think that's important to highlight and see how we can engage with that, because they do work in smaller circles, they do work at home, they do work, but they're so central to the infrastructure of these societies.
Absolutely. The lack of women empowerment, that was also partly...
I think that history teaches us that in situations of armed conflict, where you can somehow perceive that there is a struggle on the highest level, women's movements tend to recede in a kind of perhaps misdirected solidarity. This was the case in India during the anti-colonial struggle. This was the case with the Huda Sha'arawi movement in Egypt in the anti-colonial struggle. And I think there's always the temptation for these women's movements to stand back in order to finish the armed struggle first. That, of course, has not produced the kind of solution and liberty that we were aiming for in the first place. Let's hope this doesn't happen now.
And actually, unfortunately, the time is running out. It's already 11 o'clock, but perhaps just a final word of the hopeful signs that you see. A quick 1 minute per person that somehow, looking ahead, we've been listening to the need of supporting strong women movements and women's rights as one way of doing it, but any other aspects that you would like to contribute now at the very end of this seminar?
Oh, I think I need only 30 seconds.
30 seconds even.
Check me if I'm wrong. I think summing up, you talked about a new order in the Middle East. I think what we're seeing now is the end of a beginning, and it's not the beginning of the end. Things will really start to
And that was
change.
even 20 seconds.
I will go also with the 30 seconds. I think it's, for me, it's similar to giving birth. It's painful but beautiful. And that's what's going on in the Middle East. It's painful but beautiful.
A new order will be born.
Yeah, but I hold into a tragic optimism.
A tragic optimism.
Yeah, even though it's a very, very bleak. I mean, most of the friends that I know from the revolutions are behind bars. Most of them are refugees in different countries. I mean, this is just to make it as a personal story, but of course there is a bath going on. But it's the tragic optimism that gets me up in the morning.
Jan.
إذا الشعب يوما أراد الحياة فلابد أن يستجيب القدر ولابد من الليل أن ينجلي ولابد للقائد أن ينكسر. If the people one day want their life, destiny must hear and respond. The darkness of night must be dispelled and fettering chains must be broken. These are the final lines of the Tunisian national anthem. They were composed by a poet, Abu Qasim al-Shabi, in 1934. He died the year after. He was only 25. But 20 years later, in the Bourguiba revolution in Tunisia, they were inserted as a reminder to people beyond confessions, beyond sacred texts, that there is a common humanity that can break the barriers and break the wall of fear. It is from his Qasidat al-Haya, the will to life, and the final line is this: those without passion to climb up the mountains will spend their lives among holes in the ground. ما لا يعشق صعود الجبال يعيش أبد ظهري بين الحفر. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and let that be the final words. Break the walls of fear. And thank you to all of you that came to this seminar on the Middle East Beyond the Headlines, and thanks for listening. Thanks to the panelists for a very interesting conversation that we have had. It's been lengthy, but we could continue for another 3 hours, I think. But thanks for everything that you have contributed. And a round of applause to the panelists. And small gifts as well, as a sign of thanks.
Tack så mycket.